Hey guys, so with this video we're going to look at the nationalism and independence movements, the rise of nationalism and the independence movements in Africa post World War II, because we've already talked in the previous unit with India how we saw independence becoming a reality post World War II with Gandhi and the other movements in India, but now we're going to kind of shift our focus but still look at the same time frame, same time period. All right, so decolonization really began in earnest after World War II. More so, we see with India and Pakistan and countries in Asia or Southeast Asia gaining their independence much quicker. So Africa was a little slow to join the game, but we see that Libya, formerly a Italian colony that was taken over by the Allied powers in World War II, achieved independence in 1951, and then a country that was controlled formerly by the British, Southern Rhodesia, now known or now called named Zimbabwe, was the last colony to get independence, to decolonize in 1980. So it's a long time period. It was, if you look at these dates, it's in like really in chunks. There are a large number of countries that received independence in 1960. That's a really kind of, to put it lightly, a revolutionary year for for Africa. So, but it doesn't really end there. We know that just because they receive independence doesn't necessarily mean that the impact of colonial rule is gone. So I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and really think about and write down some responses in the blank space. So what might be the impact of colonial rule on a territory's future? Right, so how could having colonies there, or having a colonial power control a country, impact the potential success of a country, of a new country, a newly independent country? All right, so again, pause, take a moment, and respond to that question. One of the issues that we see kind of cropping up, not issues, I don't want to say issues because it's not an issue, but we see that many parts of Africa, many areas in Africa did not have large white European populations. Right? We really, with the exception of Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa, the majority of African nations were sparsely populated by Europeans. So that made it a lot easier for those countries to achieve independence. Right? So we see Algeria not getting out until 1962, Kenya a year later in 63, and South Africa, while independent technically, because it had gained independence earlier, it was still under white control. So it wasn't native African control. So that's a key thing to recognize with that. And so this is just the map blown up, no different than the one on the last slide. But we see, just if you want to pause here and look at it, all the countries that got their independence in 1960. So you see that, like I said before, that's a very pivotal year for Africa. Like I was saying, Algeria is one of the nations that had a high concentration or high presence of Europeans, and this was a country controlled by France. And France wanted to keep Algeria after World War II, just like they wanted to keep Vietnam after World War II, and that didn't work out so well for them. So with this increased French population, you also had an increased presence by the French government, French military. So the attempted revolt, and eventually successful revolt, was put down was resisted brutally. And we see several instances of violence on both sides and atrocities on both sides, but they do eventually get their independence in 1962, so they're a little bit behind that watershed year of 1960. But France leaving Algeria really left it in crisis, right? Where the Algerians had no training, no management experience, because they had been kept down for so long. All right, the French dominated the military. The French dominated the government. So they, when they leave, it's like they take everything with them. It's like when you think about a house, like when you're selling a house, right? When the sellers, if they take the refrigerator, the washer, the dryer, everything with them, there's nothing left. It's almost empty. So that's I don't say that's because that's an overly simplistic comparison, but it's very similar to how it is. And they, like I said, they simply just didn't know how to run their country, and that became problematic and very evident in the years and decades that followed. Many African, not just Algeria, but many African nations, that they just didn't have that experience, that the I guess experience is the best word, to run a country, and then put them in a lot of unfortunate situations. All right, so you have a little bit of space, so I want you to think about, with these maps below, what problems might arise from the borders that were created. All right, so we see the impact of, in some ways, because some of the borders did change, but the impact of the Berlin Conference, 1884 or 1885. All right. So we looked at, according to the colors, the map on the left-hand side, based on these like ethnic homelands, which we're not gonna, don't worry about the map on the right, but the ethnic homelands, these are different ethnic groups, or how they've been broken down. So how might this be problematic? So take a few moments, pause the video, like I said, then move on. But some of the problems they did face, all right, not tied to the map. So the map is different. These are different problems. So that there was an overdependence on crop exports. So they were a agricultural based economy, and that's very dangerous, especially in the modern world, where if you have a bad harvest, your entire economy is severely impacted. And then the second bullet point, we look at when these European nations leave, not so much that they take the infrastructure with them, but the lack of infrastructure, the lack of kind of a skeleton to the body of the country is problematic. All right, whereas they're developing their home, like Great Britain, the British were developing England, they weren't developing their colonies. So they're not getting the same infrastructure, bridges, roads, highways. Highways come later, but you understand what we're saying. They're not getting that same infrastructure. Something as simple as running water and toilets, they lack. Because these colonizers are not taking the time to invest to build up these colonies, because they're only interested in extracting as many resources as possible. And kind of the third problem that kind of exacerbates the previous two is overpopulation, right? Where the economy, the resources that a country has cannot sustain the population size, right? So where they just don't have the food resources, they don't have the necessary healthcare, you name it, military, whatever. They just can't care for their population. So you're going to take a moment at the end of this slide to respond to like what you see in the cartoon. But so while we're talking, look at it, think about it, and then respond. But the Europeans who did stay, they didn't. Obviously, they're living in their countries. It's their home. Right? So just because their homeland, their mother country decides to leave, it puts them in a sticky situation. Not to say they're entirely innocent of certain things, but they do have a significant shift in their lifestyle, right? Because the majority of these people have an incredibly high level of personal privilege within the country, right? Whether it's because of their wealth, because of their political power, but they have control of the resources, whether it's like electricity or some operation, and they control the government. So when the mother countries, figuratively, leave, they pull anchor and sail away. The people who are living there are kind of left to struggle with the native populations, and that's a huge, like I said on the slide here, a huge power struggle, because it's like they're simply just numerically they're outnumbered. So if the native populations wanted to rise up and slaughter all these white Europeans, it theoretically they could, just because they're outnumbered by such a significant margin. However, we know that doesn't happen. Yes, there was violence. Yes, people were killed, murdered, but not on such a massive scale. And we see when these struggles go on, it tends to be. We'll look at South Africa because that's kind of the major focus. Is they're very severe. They're very violent. And it happened a little bit in Northern Africa, but South Africa and Southern Africa, the grip on power tends to be very, very severe, or the resistance to losing that grip on power tends to be very severe. Right. So again, take a moment, pause, and respond to what do you see in the cartoon? What's going on? All right. With independence, these African nations have an incredible impact on the United Nations. This multi-governmental, this multinational, this international body that's utilized for essentially maintaining world peace. So we see that the countries that are receiving freedom in Africa and Asia in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s are dramatically increasing UN membership. And they begin to shift focus from larger issues, geopolitical issues that I think communism and capitalism, those issues, focuses on issues of poverty, racial discrimination, the after effects of imperialism, because they have greater power in the General Assembly. However, that really has a negative side effect, because then these Western powers that are like, well, we really don't want to do that, they begin to just simply ignore. Right? Western powers like Great Britain, the U.S., that have permanent seats on the Security Council, the UN Security Council, can just kind of go about their business and do what they want. And we really see, even though like certain African nations had been a part of the UN since 1945, we see Liberia being one of the first nations, and then steadily moving through the 1950s to 1960, where we see 16 nations, African nations, joining the UN General Assembly. We see a significant shift. And again, that like I said, that has the unfortunate consequence where we see these Western powers begin to kind of like push them off to the side, like, oh yeah, those are nice ideas, but we're not going to do that. So that because they had their own agenda, they had their own interests that they were going to follow and adhere to. All right, so thank you guys for listening. Talk to you guys later.